Recording. Okay, so my name is Erica Castillo. I am the co-founder and co-director of the California Small Fitness Facilities Association. Thank you again so much for being here today, and welcome to our first installment of our commercial lease best practices webinar series. We want to thank a few partners that made today's webinar happen. So thank you to the City of Sacramento, the Sacramento Metro Chamber, the MetroBusiness Center, and the SAC IEDC. We will be putting links to the organizations in the chat throughout today's presentation, and we will be doing a follow-up email as well with a link to their recording so you can get to know each organization a little bit better. Briefly, just want to tell you what the California Small Fitness Facilities Association is. If your business is not in the fitness, health, and wellness industry, we want to welcome you and thank you for coming. So we formed in 2020 in response to the pandemic. Myself and Maria have been really involved with the health, fitness, and wellness community for years before we formed the association. We both have a background in politics. She worked at the state level. I worked at the local level for elected officials, and then we were also fitness instructors. And so we came together with our government chops to form a 501c3, so a nonprofit organization. And our mission originally was to advocate for the fitness, health, and wellness industry to work with the government during the restrictions and shutdowns. And then it has evolved since then. And so right now, what we're really dedicated to is working with governments and healthcare providers to provide grants, technical assistance, and education. So we have administered quite a few grants since 2020 and technical assistance programs. So this is one of the technical assistance work that we're doing, but we work with so many different types of industries at this point. So if you're currently a small business owner or an aspiring small business owner, make sure to stay in touch with us. Follow us on social media. We're at I Love Small Fitness on Instagram. Check out our website, and definitely, of course, all of our partners as well. We have a calendar of different types of webinars and workshops to assist you in your business at whatever stage that you're at. And then just a little bit about what I do aside from our nonprofit here. I'm also a small business owner. I do digital marketing, PR, and advocacy for small businesses and nonprofits. And so some of the pain points that you've had throughout these last couple of years since the pandemic, I've also experienced that. And you'll get to know Maria in just a second about how she is also a small business owner and her journey as well. So I hope you see us as colleagues at the same time. Let's see. Oh, so Maria's going to take the floor in just a second. While she's speaking, we want to get right into getting to know our participants a little bit better. So if you can put your name, your business name in the chat. Where are you located? Just where in Sacramento or in California. You can put a zip code as well. That would be really good to know. And then the most important thing, if you can put it in the chat, let us know what is your most pressing question right now about commercial leases, so we can get Joel right into helping you get those questions answered today. He's our guest expert today. He's a commercial lease attorney, and anything else that's very specific to your business, we want to make sure we get those questions answered today. We only have an hour, so we're going to try to get to everything, but just so you know, we will have a second webinar after this that could be a follow-up to some of the questions that you bring up today. And then because we're, as small business owners, sometimes our finances are very personal. If you don't feel comfortable sharing that information, your questions in the chat, feel free to send that to me directly or Maria or Joel directly, and then we'll be monitoring the chat throughout the webinar to make sure that we're not missing any questions. So I'm going to stop talking now, and Maria, please take it away.
Thanks, Erica. So as Erica mentioned, I am one of the co-founders of the association, and I am also a fellow business owner, just like probably many of you here. I own a health and wellness, primarily fitness studio specializing in Pilates, and have been doing that since 2014. So I wanted to share a little bit of my story, kind of a whole circle that I've done going from tenant to landlord now. And in a little bit, I'll also intro Joel, who's our guest speaker. But I started my business, like I said, in 2014 in a 1,200 square foot space. And it was my first business. And it was my first time that I've ever really had to have a space that I was renting for work. So it was obviously a big deal. I did end up hiring an attorney at that time to help me read through the lease. So I really understood what I was getting into. It was a huge expense for me at the time because, as many of you know, in the beginning, everything is a big expense. So spending money on that often seems really, really challenging. But I'm really glad that I did that because he helped me understand every aspect of my lease that I wouldn't have otherwise really understood, especially when it comes to utilities and parking and things like that, that really impacted me later on. So my building was purchased 2 short years after I got into this 5-year lease. And it was at that time that it was one of the most difficult times in my business life. Of course, not counting the pandemic. The pandemic was the most difficult business time that I've had. But it was during that time when my building switched hands, and all of a sudden, the landlord, who I had a really great communication with, really great relationship with, became someone different. And it was at that time that I realized how important it was for me to have a very clear lease where no matter who the landlord is, no matter how your circumstances may change, right? The pandemic can happen, the market can change, your business can change, your landlord can change. It's really important that this document, this contract, is a contract that you understand and that it outlives all of these other changes that can happen. So it's really important that we take a very proactive role in understanding these contracts. So I expanded my building, my studio space at the time. I went through multiple changes in my leases. Needless to say, it was very, very stressful. I always like to compare it to, like, it's really, it's even if you have a landlord relationship in your regular life, right? If you rent an apartment or a house, that's very challenging. But moving or having this kind of stressful situations happen with your business, to me, it was even more challenging because it's my work and my basically my livelihood, my life. And so it's not really easy to just pick up and go somewhere else. So it becomes a really stressful thing, right? So years later, I purchased my own building. And so now I'm in my own space. So it was a dream and a goal of mine that took me a long time to get to. And I'm really, really happy that I did. And now I have my own tenant that I rent out to as well. And so it kind of came full circle. And she's a fellow small business owner. And so I wanted to be the best landlord that I could be for her now, right? So it's been a journey. So our goal today is to help you navigate your situation, whatever it may be, and to really empower you to take a really active role in your lease so that you don't leave things up to chance or to good relationships, because again, those can change, and really have an opportunity to get it right in the beginning, because it's really hard to change things. And Joel is nodding because he told me this as many times. It's really hard to change things later, right? So to do this, we invited Joel to help us. I've worked with him on multiple occasions. He is a commercial lease and contract specialist. He's an attorney with Pioneer Law Group. And most importantly, right, he has the legal background to help us answer some of your questions. I will say, though, that everyone's situation is really different. And although we cannot give you very specific advice today based on your specific circumstance, we're happy to figure out constructive ways for you to think about your situation. And then maybe you can follow up with more specifics at a later time. But Joel, is there anything you want to say that I didn't say? I kind of gave you a very brief intro, but you can jump in.
Yeah, so I'm also a small business owner. I think that was the main thing I would add. I have my small firm here in Sacramento. I started practicing in New York City, did real estate law there, and then about over 20 years ago, moved back home to Sacramento and been practicing here ever since. Do large projects. I helped the Sacramento Kings real estate attorney for their local projects, the arena, etc. Tom Ford International, the Ferry Building Marketplace in San Francisco was one of my projects, Oxbow Market in Napa. So I do a lot of large projects, but my favorite thing is helping small business owners here, because I am one, and the small businesses in Sacramento are kind of one of the main things that make this a great place to live. So however I can be of support, I try to do it.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Okay, so we thought that one of the best ways to get this conversation going, and as Erica mentioned, we really want it to be a proactive conversation. If we don't get through everything today, our goal is to come back at a later time and get to as many things as we can. But to kind of open up the floor, I wanted to introduce a few topics up for discussion that I think are big topics that you would be thinking about as a small business owner. And I didn't get a chance to read who is in the chat and basically what part of the business you're in currently, but I will do that in a second. But let's just open it up for the first topic, which is lease duration, right? So whether you're just beginning your business, that's probably most relevant at this point for you. So if you're just beginning, this is the most relevant, which is, should you sign a short-term or a long-term lease? Right. And so that's the first question that comes up. And I have helped multiple people sort of navigate that question when people ask me, what do I recommend, a short-term or a long-term lease? As a small business owner in the beginning, sometimes you may feel like it's less risky to go short-term, like a year or two, because you're not sure if your business is going to work. Maybe there's a confidence issue that you're having, like we all do when we first begin. If you don't, that's great. You shouldn't. You should just go for it. But if you are having sort of like these doubts, you may think, oh, I'll just do 1 or 2 years, which is perfectly fine, right? But the two big questions that I sort of ask myself, and I would encourage you to ask yourself, is, am I going to be really investing a lot of time and money into the space, personal money into the space, to make it work for my business? How much of that am I going to invest? And if it's a large amount, if most of the improvements that you're making are self-funded, you might really think about having a longer term lease so that in a couple of years, right, you don't have to change your location in case, again, something happens, like your landlord decides that they want to sell the building or they want to increase the rent by X amount that you may not be able to afford at a later time. The biggest question, though, that I would ask is your business plan, right? Do you have a solid business plan to begin with, and have you projected your expenses out and your revenue out, 2, 3, 5 years? What do you hope to be making in X amount of time? So oftentimes, the confidence issue or this idea that you really can only do this for 1 or 2 years often comes with us being unsure about the trajectory of our business or whether we can do it. And so I just kind of map out the worst case scenario. And I think, okay, I need to make X, right, to be able to afford this amount per month. Is that possible? In what kind of circumstances would that be impossible? And isn't my business going to be growing, at an X% rate? Do I expect to still be able to make my payments at, this kind of pay scale? And that can kind of help you. But I would love to ask Joel what you typically see in a small business type of lease. Is it 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, extensions, those kinds of things?
So I think you teed that up perfectly. I mean, I think you're balancing things when you're entering into a new lease. I think there is a tendency with small businesses to go for a shorter term lease, simply because, I mean, the benefit of a short term lease is flexibility. You know, if it's a year or two, you know, at that point you can renegotiate, you can move, you can do other things. There's some value in that. I would, and it sounded like you were going the same direction, I would tend to push towards the longer term lease for a few reasons that people might not have thought of. So when you get a longer term lease, you get a bigger asset. You have sort of more rights. If you think, we always talk in the law about ownership of a property being a bundle of sticks. And when you lease a property, you get a lot of that bundle is yours. And the longer term you have it is more of that control. So it also allows you to control the pricing. You know, if you have a short-term lease, the landlord can always change the rent. And two other things, if the location at some point doesn't work for you, there's always an option, and we may talk at some point about exit strategy, but there's always an option to sort of sell, assign, pass on at least that asset to someone else. So it isn't as though, hey, I signed a 10-year lease, and therefore I'm stuck here for 10 years. That's not necessarily what happens. And during those 10 years, we're going to have recessions, we're going to have booms, things are going to change, but you've got a baseline to work from, and you have an asset in your business. The other thing is that in the worst case scenario, if you're not able to fulfill the terms of the lease, people think about, oh, well, if it's 10 years, if it's 20 years, I owe that much rent. But the reality in California is the landlord is obligated, if the tenant isn't able to perform under the lease, the landlord is obligated to minimize his own damages, his or her. So the reality is if you get stuck with a lease you can't perform, the likely liability, we usually estimate that as between 6 months to a year of rent. I mean, it depends on the market. There's a lot of factors, but you're not thinking of it as I owe 10 years of this lease if I can't perform. You're thinking about a year anyway. So there are a lot of advantages to taking a longer term lease if you feel you can do that. You also alluded to extensions, and that's probably the most, that's the most flexibility for a tenant. Say you get a 5-year lease with a 5-year option, that gives you 5 years of the asset and the ability to control it for 10 years, but also the ability to let it go at some point. And I mean, if you're able to negotiate for that, that's a huge advantage as a tenant. Because if you don't want that next 5 years, or the rent is too high at that point, you can always renegotiate. But then the tenant in that case has control over the asset for that period of time.
Awesome. Yeah, I think I'm hearing a lot of what you're saying is like taking control over your situation, even if you're renting. Because as a business owner, it's sort of like you're renting, but it feels like you own it because everything inside you own. You own the work that you do, the community is there. You're really growing roots inside your brick and mortar. Really depends on the kind of business, of course. But a lot of the times you're really growing in that space and giving yourself the potential to be there longer on your terms, on the terms that you already know exist, is definitely, a favorable thing. I do think that the extension piece, I wasn't even really thinking about this, but I'm glad you brought this up. That was something that was in my lease. And it's another place that you want to get clarity on in your first lease is how is the extension, the possibility of you electing to do another 3, 5, 10 years. How is it written? How is it going to be decided? How much you will be paying at that time? What does fair market value? How do you define that? And then those kinds of things are important to tease out as well if you do have an extension built into your lease. Does anyone have any questions or follow-ups about this particular topic about lease duration?
I have one more addition to what you just said.
Yeah.
A little kind of secret trick that was really important to me. So I'm not a real estate broker, so I'm not usually negotiating the first business terms. I see it when the lease is drafted and it comes to me. When I see a lease with an extension at fair market value, I almost always push to change that for the tenant to not be at 100% of fair market value. For the extension, I usually want it to show for my client like 90 or 95% for this reason, that if it's a fair market value, what the landlord is telling you is that, say in 5 years, when you extend your option, they will rent the space to you at the exact same rent that they would give to anyone coming in off the street. And if someone comes in off the street, someone who's not you, they're going to have free rent period. They're going to have to invest money to fix up the premises. They're getting an advantage by you choosing to stay there. So if I see a fair market value clause, I always say, get the discount that you are owed by being the tenant that's already there. That's simplest for the landlord to extend with.
That's super valuable. I wish I knew that many years ago. That's a great way to think about it. Okay, if no one else has questions about this, I know that there was a question about what are the most, what are the things that a commercial lease should have. I think that's a bit of a complex answer because a commercial lease has a lot of components built into it. But we are kind of hitting on some of the big ones right now, right, Joel? Like there isn't really a boilerplate necessarily from our perspective, like, because usually the landlord gives the tenant a lease, correct?
Correct.
That's how that works. So it's not as though you're going to have to draft a lease on your side. It's more so that the landlord will be providing it, and then you can and we could talk about this a little bit later. What is it like to even work with an attorney like this? But normally the landlord furnishes you a lease and then you read it through and come back with questions, edits, comments, things like that.
Correct. I mean, it sounds like a simple question, but the reality is that most commercial leases have between 20 and 50 different provisions. And it's hard as an attorney to say, well, this is important and this isn't. I mean, I could probably group you like 3 or 4, like the key areas are, what are your costs? What's the rent and other charges? What is the term of the lease? What's the exit strategy? What happens if things go wrong? Things like that. But every situation is a little bit different. And like I said, there's probably 20 important parts of a lease. And maybe we can talk about this. Also came up. I got a question about kind of lease form. Like, what do you do? What do you do if you need a lease form, or what should we use as a lease form? Or what do you do if you get a lease form that you're not comfortable with? I think we'll talk about dealing with an attorney. I think that we can bring it up, talk about that then.
Yeah, totally. So the second, if no one has questions about lease duration. So the second big thing, as Joel mentioned, is the cost.
Maria?
Yeah.
Maria, sorry, I think we have a question in the comments about pricing. Is it favorable to do pricing on a longer term lease agreement?
Pricing on a longer term.
It's the last one from Nathan. Yeah. Is it favorable pricing wise to do a longer lease term agreement? Yeah.
I think it speaks to a little bit what Joel said, is that typically, it just would depend on the market, right? It would really depend on what happens to the market at the time when you are renting, right? The prices do tend to fluctuate. They do tend to go up and down, depends on the area. I would say generally, I think, and maybe Joel can chime in on that, I think when you set a longer term rate at the price that you're comfortable right now, it generally works better for you. And then if you have the extension component added, then as Joel mentioned, which is really clever and a great way to do it, you can ask for 80-90% of whatever fair market value is at the time, again, saving you potentially some money. So, but I don't know, I think it would just depend on when you're renting.
Yeah, Nathan, do you have any follow-up questions about, Maria mentioned the area or anything like that?
No, it's just mainly, is it more favorable because I'm speaking from the Bay Area, but also Sacramento, as folks immigrated out that way. And, in terms of demand and price, is it more favorable? I've talked with some brokers in the past where they're willing to maybe drop the price per square foot by X if they're willing to get a tenant in there for a longer period of time. And then I think to your point, Joel, building on that is renewal of that lease agreement or extension of, then you can negotiate a little more in between. So I didn't know if that was still the case or the trend or what is going on now and in Sacramento. So thank you.
I've also known some landlords that prefer to do 2-year leases, and they don't really care about continuity of tenant. But that I don't think is common as those who want to keep a tenant for longer, because for the reasons that Joel said, They don't have to make extra tenant improvements. They don't have to have the cost of free rent. They don't have to hire a broker to help them find a tenant. So it is favorable for landlords who generally want to keep the building fully rented for a longer period of time as an investment to them. However, I do think that there are those landlords that prefer to have shorter lease terms because they see that as a flexibility for them to raise the rent when they want to do it, or maybe they feel not as confident about the tenant. I don't know the answer to that because I don't know why they're choosing that strategy, but I do know personally a couple of landlords that only are willing to sign 2-year leases.
And I would think about it in terms of it's less of whether it's cheaper or more expensive or the high or low, is more as certainty versus uncertainty. So some tenants and landlords like the uncertainty because if the market changes, they can adjust. For a lot of businesses, it's much easier to have price certainty. And for a lot of landlords, it's better to know this is my rent, this is what it's going to be for a certain period of time. I don't have to, Maria talked about all the hassles of getting a new tenant in. So I think you'll generally find that you'll get a somewhat better rate, but I think it really just depends. I think what you're getting with a longer lease is cost certainty.
Yes. I think that's a great way to put it. So we're going to move on to our next part.
We did have one other question about pricing. It says, are commercial landlords more likely to negotiate down on a price if that space has been empty for a very long time? So, and speaking to what Nathan asked, I mean, regarding trends, Joel or Maria, I'm curious too, I think if you're seeing any different trends that are very COVID specific or what like you're anticipating, and maybe how that impacts this question about if something's been empty for a long time.
When I was looking for places for myself, I found it to be a mix. I found that some landlords were not willing to negotiate down a price. Maybe they had no urgency to rent out the space for whatever reason. And I think some are. I think it's a matter of asking. I think it's a matter of saying, figuring out what your budget is and seeing if they can meet it. But what do you think, Joel?
I mean, I think it's a general matter. Yes. I mean, the supply and demand are going to affect the rental rates, but as Maria alluded to, it's not always as crystal clear as we'd like. You'd like to say, oh, I found a place that's been empty for a long time. Therefore, the landlord will have some urgency, but the world is complicated. It's not always that way. And the pandemic has kind of made things even more uncertain. And so practices are just different. And we like to think of the market and even just in the region of like, this is what happens and this is what people do. But the reality with every real estate, with your small business, you need to find the one place. It's not about what's happening everywhere else. So, unfortunately, every situation is kind of its own deal.
Yeah. Okay. So the next topic, speaking of controlling for costs, is your actual lease payments. So now we get into like a little bit of technical stuff, which is important, and I'll lean on Joel to chime in a little bit, but are you signing a lease that has a triple net clause in it, or is it a gross lease? So generally for a triple net lease, tenants pay additional expenses in addition to the lease fee to the landlord. They can include such things as property taxes, property insurance, also things like CAM, which is short for common area maintenance, which could be things like if you share a bigger space with multiple tenants, it could be things like cleaning exterior, cleaning interior, all those kinds of things. And it's different from a gross lease, which usually the costs for the landlord are already built into the price. And so in my experience, this is the area that you really have to look carefully into and watch out for, because again, like Joel mentioned, as a tenant, you really want to be able to control your costs and know what your costs are going to be in terms of monthly payments. And when I first learned about triple net as a tenant, I thought it was kind of crazy. I was like, okay, so now we're paying for the landlord's property taxes and whatever improvements they want to make. So I'm basically own the building, but I don't own the building. I'm paying for the landlord to own the building. And unfortunately, it is a little bit like that. But if you really think about it, if you're renting an apartment somewhere or a house somewhere, it's quite similar. It's just maybe not expressly it's maybe not expressly put that way, but the big difference to me is the variability of it. And so this is what I kind of wanted to ask Joel. Is it the nature of triple net payments that it leaves this room for variability, and it makes the tenant not really know what the payments are going to be, these extra payments on the monthly basis? Or is there room to negotiate a set CAM amount or triple net amount, I guess?
All really good questions, and this is pretty a broad subject. I would say I tend not to focus quite so much on the terminology, because as a practical matter, as a tenant, you are paying for those costs anyway, right? I mean, the idea that somehow you're going to get out of paying for the landlord's cost of operations just generally doesn't exist. That's going to be on the tenant. And the question is, how are those things paid? So the triple net, while it's a little bit more complicated, you need to be a little more focused on the lease. At least is somewhat sort of upfront about you're paying directly for those costs rather than them just being plugged in by the landlord. And you have some protection in that way, and you have some ability to negotiate what you're paying. When it comes to paying those triple net costs, I think so there's two areas that I might negotiate as a tenant. One is to separate the costs of operating the property, which I think landlords tend to pass on to the tenants, versus the cost of owning the property. And that should be the landlord's obligation. So the cost of buying the property, capital improvements that make the property more valuable, those should be landlord's costs. That's their benefit. But the operating of the property is usually passed through the tenants. So we do things when we're negotiating triple net, costs, the additional rent clauses, the CAM charges. We as the tenant's attorneys try to protect the tenant from having things that shouldn't be included in there. I think the other thing that you can try to do, and this is should be done up front, is negotiate for a cap on those expenses. Landlords don't always like that, because the whole point is they can't predict what the costs are going to be, so they're passing them through. But it's understandable up front for a tenant to say, hey, I don't know what the future is going to look like. I can only budget for so much. That's the risk should be shared. And you share that risk by capping how much the increase can be over every year, by setting a total maximum number. There's different ways to do it, but you can cap those additional costs so that at least you can budget for them.
That's super helpful. So what it sounds like to me is that you want to, just like other parts of your lease, really be clear about what those additional payments are that you're paying for. And I guess in some cases, would it be appropriate to have proof that those things cost what the landlord says that they cost? For example, let's say, I don't know if are utilities often a part of this, or are they separate? In my experience, they've always been separate, but I'm just using it as an example to say, like, could you be asking your landlord through the lease, show me what your expenses are, prove that, the SMUD bill is this much. And then, yes, then I will pay for whatever my share is, if that's how your lease is set up.
Yeah, so I would answer that. Again, there's a number of different, you brought up several different points. One, in a true gross lease, the utilities are usually included. So this is why I try not to focus too much on the name of the lease. It's more like, what do you have to pay for, and who pays it and how. So that's something to be clear on. I would say more often than not, the tenant ends up paying utilities directly. However, utilities for common areas are often passed through, as well as additional rent in the triple net lease. So those do get included. And often, it's getting into the weeds a little bit, but when we're negotiating what those additional costs are, and we say, hey, but as tenant, we need a cap, often what the landlords will say is, fine, have a cap on the things that I as landlord can control. Like, I decide how much I'm paying for the landscaping, whatever, but things like utilities and insurance, third-party security, third-party costs, I can't cap those because I'm just paying them to someone else. So that is a subject, I'm just a way of saying that is a subject of some negotiations, but I think most of the time landlords will want to recover those costs, whatever they are. But not always. Sometimes you can get those capped. And in these days when, you know, the price of utilities could fluctuate a lot, that's a wonderful thing to have capped if you can do it.
Right. So it sounds like what you're saying is it's good to have a cap, but it's not always, it's the nature of these variable costs to be variable. So it's potentially to some extent an unpredictable cost to a certain extent, depending on what the actual charges are. But you are best off if you know what your maximum amount would be. If you
and I actually didn't answer one of your questions, which is ideally in a commercial lease, you will, and if there's triple net, if they're actually paying the actual cost of the landlord and it's put into the lease, then the landlord should include in there a right to do an audit by the tenant. And audit rights generally can be as simple as going and looking at their books and records, or having them provide the books and records, or it can be actually having a firm go in and once a year go do a look at the landlord's book and records to show that they're actually paying those costs. It's legitimate, because, you know, we like to think that accounting books and bookkeeping is, you know, it's black and white, but it's not always that way. So to your point, if you have the ability to have a lawyer look at your lease, that's something, an audit right for those costs is a great idea. I think the other point there, because you can't always predict what those costs are, is to be absolutely clear in your lease with the landlord up front before you get started. What things am I paying for? Am I paying for the sewer and water and garbage? Am I paying for the common area utilities? I know I have to pay for my own utilities. What else is out there? I think being clear on that, understanding that up front is critical. So I think it's a good thing to bring up.
Yeah, I think it's extremely critical, actually. That's why we bring it up today, because these things, you know, they fluctuate. In your head, you're thinking, well, how much could it possibly cost to clean this building? I can find somebody that can clean this building for $150 a month. And my landlord is charging $600 for that every month and passing 300 of it to me and 300 to the other tenant. So I think it's definitely something that is a huge area to look at. I also asked the question about furnishing proof of how much things cost, because I've been in a situation, my first lease was a gross modified, but that's, you know, again, doesn't mean anything. It just was, everything was what it was. There was a flat fee, but then the utilities component, I was paying a portion of the utilities depending on my square footage. Well, one year, my landlord sent me a bill for $3,000 saying that this is my portion. And it was like really out of the blue. I've never had to pay more than a couple $100s. And I asked to see proof of how much it actually cost them to pay for the whole building and then what my share was. And because they couldn't furnish any receipts or proof of anything, they just dropped the topic and moved on, because I asked to see the proof of it. So that wasn't in my lease. They didn't say they have to provide that for me, but it just seemed really sort of out of the blue. And I don't, you know, and that's something that I wish my lease said, that when you're calculating these charges, and you would have to, for a year, you would provide the receipt for how much you paid. And I mean, is that typical, or does it have to be an audit? Kind of.
So as someone brought up in the comments, I think most of the attorney drafted leases that I work on have a provision that says that after the end of every year, the landlord will then do a full accounting, and within 90 to 100 days after the end of the billing year, they'll send, you know, a reconciliation to the tenant. There'll be adjustments that are made. It happens after the end of the lease too. That's pretty typical. Those, you know, every landlord's gonna be a little different about what they provide, however. So having another sentence or two that says, and, you know, you know, either the audit right or some ability to see the actual books and records, I think is is useful. But yeah, there should be an accounting at the end of the year where they show you what actually was paid. And with things like utilities, it should be very clear. I mean, I think the other thing to think about there is what, you said you're paying based on the square footage you want to be sure that you're paying only your percentage of the square footage, whether or not they're able to rent. Like if it's multiple tenants in a building, you want to make sure it makes sense in terms of what you're paying for, because you don't want to be in a situation where there's no other tenants and suddenly you're paying some inflated amount or an inflated percentage simply because you're the only one there. Typically with leases, it's your square footage of the entire building, regardless of whether they're leased. And there's some, I won't get into the weeds more there, but there are some provisions that can talk about how you do it. But you just don't want to be in a situation where you're paying for the entire building.
Right, yeah.
Unless you are the entire building.
Right. Okay, am I missing something in the comments? Does anybody have any additional questions about this? This is one of those topics that we can, like we're doing now, talking generally, but you really, to me, this is like worth the startup cost of hiring an attorney, just getting this very clearly laid out in case you are having a difficult time, coming back to your landlord and asking for these changes yourself. Something drafted by your attorney would really just kind of go a long way in making sure that you're getting something that you really are happy with. Because like Joel mentioned, things are just really, it's all in the details of the wording and how the lease is actually, structured. So any other questions on this part? Oh.
If we want to go into 10:50, I did catch a few questions that may or may not be related to this topic that we can get answered by the 11 o'clock.
Sure. I think it's maybe important to just go into what you can expect, since we're kind of on this topic, when you do hire an attorney to help you with the process. And that's when maybe Joel can answer some of the other questions that came up earlier. There was that question about the outline, and I mentioned earlier that usually the landlord provides the lease, and then you are looking at it, reading through it, and coming back. But I thought maybe Joel, you can kind of tell everybody what they can expect if they are hiring somebody to look at their lease, because I think there's the lease, the initial part, then there is the potential for negotiation, then there is other issues that come up, and it seems all very daunting, but I would like to just kind of break it down.
Yeah, so I think this is probably the most important thing we'll talk about in this hour, which is with a small business on a limited budget starting up, the tendency is not to go see a lawyer about things like this. And we could talk for hours about this, but I guess I know lawyers are expensive, and so I'd like to, as much as possible, take away that fear, because lawyers are expensive, but they're much cheaper before you have a problem. And if you go to a lawyer and say, hey, I have $1,000 in my budget, I have this lease, can you just spend a couple of hours taking a look at this for me and tell me what the issues that may come up? And then to the extent that that's it, at least you've had that review, and you can take it to, you have more confidence about what you're signing when you go to the landlord. If you have a problem with your lease, lawyers are incredibly expensive. Litigation is unbelievably expensive. So I would just encourage you to seek out an initial consultation. Tell the attorney up front, this is what I can do, this is what's in my budget. That there's nothing to hide there. That's we're business owners too, we get it. And I know I appreciate it so much when someone comes to me first rather than comes to me later when, oh my goodness, I'm in this situation, it's terrible. And then I say, well, this is what the lease says. And there's not a lot I can do about it at that point. And so, yeah, the other thing would be setting a budget, setting expectations. The things that cost a lot more money in the initial lease stage are the drafting, negotiating portions. So to the extent that you can take on a lot of those, agents and lawyers are very different. Your agent, their time is free. So utilize that time to handle lots of the negotiations, especially about business terms, but they also have different motivations. They get paid when lease is signed. Lawyers there to look out for you. So I would just try to utilize the time, whereas my time is by the hour, agent time is free, except that their motivation is different. So I would just try to use that time smartly and work with your lawyer, whose, job, our duty is to, loyalty to you, work out how that time is most effective for you.
That's really helpful. Any follow-ups on that? For me personally, it evolved as my business evolved. So in the very beginning, I basically just could afford enough for someone to read my lease, give me some additions, clarifications. And I believe that the first time I came back to the landlord with those changes, and that's how I handled it. The second and third time, I think I had my attorney directly communicate with the landlord, which was more expensive just because it was a couple of extra hours of work. But you could always start really small and just hire an attorney to read through your lease, give you edits and questions and red flags that you can then take to your landlord. And like Joel said, it is, to you a lot of money. It was to me, it still is to me. Anytime I have to have any legal work, I always know that it's going to be expensive, but it is a smaller price to pay, because if you think about the cost of having a lease that is really difficult for you on the monthly basis, and the payments are starting to go up, or there's a situation that happens and you weren't aware of, that now you are all of a sudden paying more than you thought, it's a lot more expensive, I think, than initially taking care of it. And it just gives you the confidence to be really empowered and control your business in all aspects. So I think it's definitely worth it. And
Yeah,
then,
sorry to interrupt. I think one of the things that the thing that we can do is help you assess risk in the lease, because as a business owner, you're probably really good at assessing, risk on the business world. But in a lease, you may have things that are, oh, that's a red flag, but you don't know, and the landlord won't change it. And you need to know, is this something that's going to be a dire problem for me in a year, or is this a risk I can take? And that's a large part of what lawyers do too, is assessing the different risks that come up until that's really important. You need to fight on it, and that's when you don't love it, but you can let it go.
yeah.
I can read off some of the questions that we missed really quick.
Okay.
Okay, so we have, I'll go into the specific ones, and there's like a general question. So one question was, what are the best resources to find commercial lease opportunities outside of the LoopNet?
I've really only utilized my car driving around and looking for a place that has a for rent sign, but I've also used a broker once that was recommended to me by another fellow small business owner. And the nice thing about, if you find a broker that you like, the nice thing is you're not, in my experience and my understanding of it, is you're not paying commission to them for finding the building. It's the landlord that pays for that. So it's essentially free for you to have somebody out there looking for you when you're busy doing the work that you're doing, because it could be a full-time job looking for a place to rent. So that's the benefit of it. But as Joel mentioned, right, you have to be very clear about what you like, what you're interested in, as far as the building, and also making sure that you're not pushed in any way to rent a place and into a lease that you're not really happy with, because they do want to rent out the place because it is a commission-based job for them. I'm not here to say that they don't have your best interest at heart. They probably want to help you as well, and they probably care about you as well. But it's just something to think about, right? They are not they're working for you, but also they're working for your landlord to rent out the space for them. But they could be really helpful. And I do have, if you're in Sacramento, I think that you are. Yes, I do. I could recommend that that broker firm to you, and you can use them or not. That could be something.
Great. Two more questions that we missed. So Lakinia Henry with Sugar Coated Cupcakes in Elk Grove has a question, and feel free, Lakinia, to chime in. The question she had was, how do we get the best idea on build out costs?
Correct. So I have been on the hunt, literally looking for a space, and there's a potential opportunity now, but I'm trying to understand like what are the build out costs that I should expect. Obviously for us, we're going to need a full kitchen setup, right? So a shell space is not going to work for us as it would just a general retail operation. So I'm, trying to understand like, what cost should I expect? What's kind of like the average? I think I'm just lost on that.
That's such an important piece. That's a huge one. Joel, maybe you start first with like different possibilities, and I'll chime in with what my experience has been.
Sure, yeah, probably both are helpful. So if you're going to have to do a build out, the ideal situation would have your own contractor who's on your team and goes with you into the space and gives you that sense. Because if you have that, you can take it to the landlord. And ideally, if you're fixing up their space, that they, to encourage you to sign a lease, they often will help pay for part of the build out costs or give you free rent for a period of time to offset the build out costs. Because if there's a large build out needed, that should not, in theory, that should not be all on the tenant. But having a number or a sense of what that really is I think it's part of your question, is I think there's only really a contractor, an architect or designer could really give you that number. So if and it's better to have your own person than the landlords, but sometimes the landlord will have someone who will do that, especially if they're paying. But ideally you have someone on your team that you can trust to come up with that number, so you can present it to the landlord and hopefully offset it.
That's really good. So I did an expansion at my location where we doubled in size. And at that point, I was renting from a landlord who wasn't the one I had a great relationship with. And so I primarily took on the cost of the remodel myself for the reasons that Joel said. I think that sometimes when the landlord takes care of the remodel or takes care of the build out, it can take a much longer time than you want, or it's just not on your schedule, right? It's on their schedule with their contractors, with their whatever their time frame is. And it depends how the cost would be passed down to you. The way that I did it is I took it on myself, which I'm very happy that I did, because I was able to open my business faster. I was able to keep my costs down because it was a contractor that I trusted and that we worked together. And I did it during the times that worked conveniently for me. Now, the problem with that is that I improved that building and then I left, right? So all of the money sort of went to improving my landlord's space for them to have it for free, basically. They didn't give me a lot back because their preference was to do the remodel themselves. So giving me autonomy was their negotiating piece. And they said, well, if you want to do it yourself, that's fine, but we're only going to give you, I believe they gave me a credit for flooring because I said flooring you'll keep, and they gave me a little bit of credit for redoing some of the electrical work. But I know this is a really stressful and a huge kind of price that you weren't even thinking about. And so I think it really depends. I also know some landlords that when it comes to doing something like a kitchen, they have provided that for the tenant because that's a big barrier. If they want to make their space available for restaurants or places like yours in the future, they're going to want to make those improvements anyways, because they may see that in the future they can rent it out as a restaurant, and that's a huge incentive, and it's expensive. It's an expensive part. So I think you have some negotiating power. Like, I think that you can figure out what is the best case scenario for you. Are you in a rush to open? How much does it matter for you to have this control? And when you are negotiating, is there like a time that the landlord has to be done with construction? What happens if they don't meet that deadline? Those kinds of things. And if you want to do it yourself, then what can you negotiate for that? I think that you have the power to do the negotiating here for sure. There's not really like this is how it's always done, because it really just varies. I would love to hear the update about this, by the way. You should reach out to us and tell us how it's going. I'm rooting for you to open this cupcake place.
Thank you. It's been a learning experience, and I remember the first time I heard triple net, I was like, "What?" I was talking to a broker on the phone, and I literally jumped on Google. I'm like, "What the heck is he talking about? This? What is triple net?" So this whole process has been just it's stressful in some ways, but when I saw this webinar, I was like, "Oh my gosh, thank goodness! There's going to be something on commercial leasing for dummies." So thank you for this, and I'll definitely keep you updated.
Yes, please do.
So yeah, we missed one question, which was a general question at the beginning, but we can definitely go over, I mean, we did kind of cover it in general terms. And I think some of the questions that we miss at the end of the chat, we can definitely go into the next webinar series. I guess as a wrap up, because this is a question for someone who is just about to start looking for a space, and this is someone in the health and wellness industry, they want to be able to rent and train clients in Curtis Park, and they're just curious, how do I start the leasing process as a small business owner? I'd like to have my own place that clients can come to. So it sounds like they have been renting out space previously, as a sole proprietor, and they're trying to, scale their business into their own space. So aside from kind of what we talked about today, Maria or Joel, do you have any just kind of final tips on getting to that next stage in their business?
I would say for me, it's just to just first figure out what your budget is. Figure out how many clients you need to see, and or what your other expenses are, and figure out what is a solid budget where you can see it working for you to rent out rent a space for your business. That would be number one. And then number two would be to just start looking. I mean, just see what the going rate is for the kind of space that you want. Curtis Park is definitely on a more challenging side, just because, well, I'm in Curtis Park, so I definitely know it's on the more challenging side just because there's not a lot of availability there. There's a few commercial spaces, but not a ton. And, each neighborhood is differently priced. So I would just start looking. So I would just basically start with the budget and then just start looking. And if you find your dream space, just give them a call and start the process. You can always say, "Oh, never mind, I'm not interested," or "not this time," but start taking little steps in the direction that you want to go into, just one little step at a time. That would be my 2 cents.
Joel,
Two things to add to that. I think she has the best practical advice. I just thought if you can contact a real estate agent who works actually in commercial leasing, and there are a few around town, they can be very helpful in locating the space once you have the things in mind that Maria talked about. And I think the second thing is to consider establishing an entity, a limited liability company for your business, rather than keeping this sole proprietorship. Once you start doing things like leasing and insurance and things like that, it can protect you quite a bit.
Sounds like we need to do a webinar on that part.
Yeah.
That's a whole other, yes, absolutely. Thank you. That's so
Thank you, Maria and Joel, for your expertise today. If anyone wants to get off mute and just say some last words, we did miss a couple of things that we had in our outline, like force majeure and so we will definitely carry that into our next webinar, and we'll be sending out a wrap-up email with some links to definitely go to metrobusinesscenter.org to see what else is on the calendar coming up with the technical assistance work. We're just one of many contractors that is working with small businesses for COVID recovery, and definitely go to our website to get to know more about the types of grants that we administer for small businesses with our government and healthcare partners. And again, thank you to the city of Sac Metro Chamber, Metro Business Center, and Sac IADC for making this possible. And again, thank you, Maria and Joel, so much for your expertise today.
Thank you everyone for your awesome questions and good luck. And I wish you the best with all this. And I hope this was really helpful for you.
Yeah, feel free to send us an email and when we send out the recording and some of the links to the resources with any follow-up questions that you want for our second webinar that we do later on this year. Cool. All right, well, thanks you guys. I'm gonna stop the recording now.